Hello and welcome to Climate Watch, the program that explores how the world is tackling climate change. Every week, we talk with experts, innovators, and change makers who are driving the clean energy transition, shaping climate policy, and rethinking sustainability. I'm Fei Fei, and today we're bringing you a special episode on COP30. As you can see, we have different setups here in the studio. With COP30 in full swing in the heart of the Amazon rainforest in the city of Belém, Brazil, negotiators are once again debating critical issues like who will pay for climate action, especially adaptation as extreme weather events become more frequent and the links to climate change increasingly clear. And what responsibilities should we put in place, and also where are we headed as a global community? We're seeing familiar agendas on the negotiation table, but with heated arguments, but only modest steps forward. So, are COP meetings still relevant today? And how can we make better use of this grand global gathering? To help unpack these big questions, I'm joined by two important figures in the global climate policy in the studio and also on the line. We have Teng Fei in the studio here. Teng Fei is a professor and deputy director of the Institute of Energy, Environment and Economy at Tsinghua University. His main research include energy system analysis, global and domestic climate policy and governance. He had also been a member of China's negotiation team on climate change for 10 years up till 2017. Hello, Professor Teng.
Hello.
I'm going to refer to Professor Teng as Professor Teng today, otherwise our names will be very confusing because we share the same given name. And on the line today we have Antoine Augy, the Executive Director at the Institute for European Environmental Policy based in Brussels. Antoine has over 15 years of experience working with stakeholders across EU and in civil society and industry to produce research and insights on EU sustainability policies. His research focuses notably on the EU's internal and external policies related to trade, climate, and the circular economy. Hello, Antoine. Thank you for joining us today.
Hello, Faye. Thank you so much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So I want to check with you guys first and foremost with one big question. Do you still believe in the multilateral climate bodies like COP meetings today still playing a very important role in the world? I'll start with you, Professor Teng.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, given we are facing tremendous difficulties right now. But from my perspective, I do have the confidence, and I believe probably the multilateral form, such as the UNFCCC, is the only way we can identify a solution. The reason for that is because of, although we need to reach consensus to make things happen under UNFCCC, sometimes it's slow, sometimes it's painful, but that is the only approach that we can bring all more than 190 countries on the earth together and to identify a solution that we all agree on it. So although that we are facing tremendous difficulties right now, but I do have the faith, and I think that we should stick to this multilateral process and to overcome those barriers and move forward.
And for Antoine, I think in today's day and age, we are seeing a lot of resistance globally when it comes to climate change. Even there are some views that claiming that climate change is a hoax or renewable energy is a lie. And what do you take on the role that multilateral gatherings like COP meetings can play in the world?
Thank you. This is a very good but very challenging question because we see this process happening pretty much all over the world of, if not denial, at least some doubts as to the reality of climate change and of its impacts. We're seeing this in Europe as we speak. We're obviously seeing this in the United States to a very large extent. And that, as Professor Lim has just mentioned, creates a lot of challenges for meaningful conversations to happen on the global stage. what we need to remember in this aspect is that from a scientific perspective, the impact, the reality of climate change cannot be overstated. This is a reality that we are faced with. It's not just coming from one particular part of the globe, it's happening everywhere, and all climate scientists are telling us the same. So this is the reality that we need to confront ourselves with. And for that, I couldn't agree more. Again, Professor, saying that the UNFCCC provides us with the framework to have that conversation. It is very hard to reach a consensus on all of these aspects because it touches upon so many different sectors of our lives. Of course, the emissions of our industrial policy, but also our food system, the food that we eat, the heating of our homes, etc., etc. So with all of the diversity of the world, of course, it is a challenge. It should be a challenge. But now this framework exists. And I would actually argue that the difficulties, that the challenges of the moment are actually an opportunity for all of the parties of the UNFCCC to reflect on their own role, on their own capacities to enact the change within this framework.
Yeah, I really like your take when it comes to challenges, that challenges are not only challenging, but also bring opportunities. And so I'm curious that what new roles or new function do you see UNFCCC or COP meetings or any multilateral gatherings when it comes to climate change or even broader in industries and economies? What should be their new functions?
Well, this is, again, the main challenge, the reaching a consensus, and by that being concrete. What kind of solutions, what kind of agreement concretely can the COP bring forward? It is a magnificent framework for a conversation, but what can it bring concretely to people's life? Now we are 10 years after the Paris Agreement. Now it's a test. Now it's really the moment to say, okay, we can actually enact some changes through the COP process. This is very much what the Brazilian presidency of COP has said, saying that they want to focus on implementation. That is this concrete change that they can bring about. So, for instance, I will look for this year, the COP30 in Belém in Brazil, I will look at two particularly important outcomes, potential outcome of the conversation. One is on the roadmap for climate finance. We know that there is a certain amount that countries have pledged to reach in terms of climate finance. So how do we get there? What is the roadmap to get us there? That is a concrete outcome that the Brazilian presidency is hoping to reach right now in Belém. The second one is the transition away from fossil fuel. That is also a concept that's been agreed upon very recently in the past COPs. But now, how do we actually do that? How do we operationalize this transition away from fossil fuel, which is a fundamental aspect of the fight against climate change? So these are two, but among several other examples that I could bring as to how now the COP conversation can get into concrete results.
Yeah, so since Antoine mentioned very two important topics at COP meetings, and I can't help but start to thinking about the last conversation me and Professor Teng had for COP29. That was known for the finance COP last year. And as Antoine mentioned, as one of the results of that COP, that developed nations pledged to mobilize $300 billion for developing countries by the year 2035. And these results will be a main task for COP30 this year. So Professor Teng, how do you evaluate, the progress or process for these financing goal that we set last year?
Yeah, firstly, I'd like to say one of the key role of the UNFCCC is to facilitate the implementation of various countries that to implement their commitment, and the so-called means of implementation is very important, which includes both finance, technology, as well as capacity building. And one of the main reasons that we lack of progress at this moment, the reason for that, from my perspective, is because of the lack of progress on the provision of the finance, which is critical for developing countries, but right now is not in place at this moment. So if we want to move forward to increased ambitions from both developed and developing countries, that to further improve this provision of finance is critical. But unfortunately, that the current progress is not very satisfactory. I think that if we look back to the progress of the so-called 2020 target for 100 billion, it has been delayed for years to achieve that target. And also for the 2035 300 billion, there is no clear roadmap at this moment. You also mentioned that in the decision last year, the wording is mobilize, is not to provide. There is some difference that in those wordings. But another very important perspective from my side is we should not only look at the volume of those $300 billion as means of implementation, but also should focus on the capital or on the cost of the capital, which is one of the key barriers for developing countries to achieve low carbon transition at this moment, because of their cost of capital right now is much more expensive, at least 2 times expensive than that of developed countries. That is one of the fundamental reasons why there is lack of progress of transition in most of the developing countries. So if we want to facilitate the implementation of developing countries, we should not only look at those 300 billions, but also try to lower the cost of the capital for them.
What caused the high costs among developing countries?
Which is the cost of the capital, because of the, that the renewable technology, the low carbon transition technology is very capital intensive. And so it is sensible for the interest of the rate. And the interest of the rate in developing countries is much higher. So we need to work together and to use innovative approach to help developing countries to lower those cost of capital. From my perspective, I believe that is also a very important issue.
Mm-hmm. And since you mentioned that the wording when it comes to pledges coming out of COP meetings, that usually includes pledges coming from the global north to the global south. And for me, I think that's one of the biggest gap at the moment when we are talking about any negotiations or any responses when it comes to tackling climate change, implementation on adaptation, mitigation, you name it. So I'm wondering about your guys' take on, when we're seeing this gap between the global north and the global south, what can we do? How should we, close the gap or narrow the gap? Is there ways for us to rebuild or initiating more cooperation between these two?
Well, this is a fundamental question. As Professor had mentioned, the previous pledge from developed economy to the developing world of this 100 billion per year took way longer than expected to actually be met, several years. That did not help in terms of trust. We've talked about the role of the UNFCCC and the COP as a framework, as a platform for all of these countries to talk together. You need a lot of trust in order to have meaningful exchange happening. And at the end of the day, the finance question is at the heart of the trust question. The vocabulary that is being used, mobilize instead of provide. Okay, so this is indeed 300 billion that are eventually going to be pledged to provide by the developed economy, and then that it will help mobilize the 1.3 trillion by 2035, which would largely come from private capital at the end of the day. This is all okay in terms on paper, and we understand the principle, but it has to start with fulfilling the pledge from the developed economy side. Otherwise, they cannot be trusted, and if they cannot be trusted, they cannot be a meaningful conversation. That's one thing, absolutely key. And then, of course, once we have that, then it would unlock so many potentials that the professor already touched upon. All of these blended finance instruments, all of these risk guarantees that the provided finance could help unlocking this private capital, which would eventually help lower the cost of capital to be mobilized in developing economies and help them develop their own strategic priorities for climate mitigation and adaptation. Some will choose to focus on industrial policy with local value creation and to embed themselves into global value chain. Some others will favor making sure that they have sustainable food systems in place in countries that are net food importers, for instance, when food security is a massive issue, especially when facing climate impacts. So these are all, we can all have very concrete conversation in the context of the roadmap as long as we start from the point of the pledge of the public finance provided by developed economies. This has to be the start.
So, Professor Teng, you also believe that a large part of that fund would come from the private sectors?
Well, I think that firstly, from most of the developing countries' perspective, they think that most of those $300 billion should be public finance. But for me, I think that we need a blended financing system, as Antoine has said. Those 300 billion plus other sources from the private sector, which will help developing countries to accelerate their transitions towards the net zero. So we need to have those finance roadmap as soon as possible. That is the first step to restore the confidence and trust among developed and developing countries. As well as I think that we should frame the discussion not only under UNFCCC but also in other form of the climate as a discussion within the context of sustainable development. That is not the case because of most of the climate negotiation or discussion use a so-called climate-specific approach. They only talk about emissions without taking into consideration of the implication on local peoples in developing countries, without putting that in the broader context of sustainable development priorities. I think that context of sustainable development must be remain the focus of the discussion. Make sure that the developing countries can achieve the development at the same time to cope with climate change at both. That win-win, yeah.
And that make me think of, at this COP, there is another big word, which is called adaptation. That a lot of, especially developing countries, are calling for more efforts, more talks for building up their adaptation capacities. And I also thought about, in China, when we submitted our NDC this year, there is one clause about building China as the adaptive society, which is the first time for China to include that. And so I'm really curious about your takes on the adaptation building part. How should we build adaptation? And especially when it comes to you two coming from two different contexts, one from the developed world, one from the developing world. So what is adaptation building, for example, in the EU, Antoine?
Well, that is a very good question because the EU is arguably lagging a bit behind on adaptation. There is a very fundamental reason to that. It's that for many, many years and even decades, the priority for the European Union as one of the most important emitters of greenhouse gases around the world was to mitigate these emissions. And so all of the political capital and all of the financial capital was essentially poured into mitigation aspects. And the adaptation conversation was a very complicated one because it was feared that any effort that was then targeted at adaptation would then be taken from and hinder the mitigation effects. So this has always been a bit of the complicated conversation at the EU level. Whereas, of course, it's two sides of the same coin. At the end of the day, both need to be tackled. There is this realization that is happening in the EU. There is more and more talk of adaptation policies happening at the EU level. We agreed on the adaptation strategy back in 2021 to actually sort of bring together and have a coherent approach for adaptation. And there is now a new expected policy initiative on adaptation that is expected next year on resilience strategy. So this would be, let's say, the next step. Make sure that the EU proposes a coordinated approach on adaptation. Of course, this will still need to happen within the context of the global goal of adaptation, which is a specific part of the Paris Agreement dedicated to that topic, to make sure that the EU's efforts on adaptation happens in a coherent way with the rest of the world. Because, of course, our realities when facing climate change can be different, and so our adaptation needs will be obviously quite different from other parts of the world.
And I have to follow up on you when it comes to the EU context, is that the EU also just submitted their NDC right before the right before COP30 actually. So it's been a very, I don't know if I'm using the right word here, but excruciating, excruciating experience for the EU to submit their NDCs. So I'm also curious about your take on your evaluation and assessment for this new homework that EU submitted.
I think excruciating is the right word for it. I would probably use the same. It has been long and painful. Now, there is an updated NDC submitted, but with a range. So that's quite new. It's not a target anymore, it's a range. So we committed to reduce our emissions by between 66 and 72% by 2035. This in itself is rather disappointing from a climate science perspective, because we know that we should be on the upper side of that range if we want to follow, from a scientific perspective, a trajectory that gets us toward a net zero economy by 2050, which is our legal obligation as per EU law. So, whereas a 66% is essentially a business as usual scenario. So that range gives a lot, arguably too much flexibility to give us any meaningful idea of where the EU might go on that basis from a legislative standpoint. So now the important part on the EU side is to have a climate target for 2040 that is as ambitious as possible, moving into the 90% reduction by 2040, which eventually puts us on the path of a net zero economy by 2050 and on the path of that upper range of the NDC that we have just submitted. So now this is where the homework starts really for the European Union, is to design, to update its own climate framework, which is arguably among the most ambitious in the world already. It needs now for 2030. It needs now to be updated to 2040 and to 2050 in order for us to reach these ambitious legal objectives. That's clearly the priority right now.
So you still believe that EU, even though with some hesitation or with some setbacks on the way, it is still moving towards fulfilling its ambitions?
The EU is on track to fulfill its 2030 target, which was 55% reduction compared to 1990 levels. So that's a significant achievement already. A lot of progress has been made in recent years through the deployment of renewables, through the electrification of our energy systems, etc., and others. So this is the first step has been. Now we know what other sectors need to be tackled in order to continue the work: transport, buildings, and so on and so forth. So the science is there and the sectors are identified. So we are on track for our short-term objective. As I said, now we need to design the policy framework to a medium-term and long-term objective. But yes, I fundamentally believe that despite the fact that we are in a very challenging political context that is not necessarily conducive for ambitious climate policy at EU level, so much work has been already done, so much investment have been already made, so much policy frameworks have been already designed, that there is now a very strong path dependency for the EU to continue down that road.
And actually, when it comes to NDCs, I think I've heard similar comments for China's NDCs, that the targets that China set is also a range. And a lot of people are saying that China didn't set its targets ambitious enough, that China can do more and should do more. So Professor Tang, I'm wondering, what do you take on, China's target?
Well, I think firstly, if we look at China's NDC, China is clear that is a flaw, which means China will do more. But to what extent China can do, it fully depends on a lot of uncertainty factors, which China cannot determine at this moment. For example, in the next 10 years, the socio-economic growth target for China is about 5% per year till 2035. I mean, the Chinese economy will grow averagely 5% per year. And if you take that into consideration, China's NDC, which is aiming to reduce its all greenhouse gases to, by 7 to 10%, will be translated to annual carbon intensity reduction about 6%, and which is very challenging if you look at the historical record of China's carbon intensity reduction. In the last 5 years, China has achieved about a 4% carbon intensity reduction per year. But we all know that in the past 2 or 3 years, China are facing a much slower reduction of carbon intensity. So given that historical record, China plans to achieve or even accelerate the carbon intensity reduction from previous 4% to 6% per year. I think that is definitely a very ambitious movement. And also, if we get into some detail of China's NDC, for example, the installation of the wind and solar capacity in China, most of observers believe China can do more, but they may not understand that the difficulties China are encountering at this moment, and especially together with this increasing share of renewables, China are facing great challenge on the dispatch in the system and how to consume those increasing share of wind and solar given the current grid power grid structures here in China. So definitely that China will do more, but China is in a very uncertain stage, which China need to cross the river by filling stones. And when the transition trends is there, I personally believe that China will deliver its ambitions with a higher achievement in the future.
And when it comes to, building an adaptive society for China, what do you think are the challenges for that task?
Well, I think firstly, which is quite similar with what has been discussed by Antoine, that the adaptation, in fact, is critical, but for a long time, the adaptation is lack of a clear target. That is also why that in Berlin this year, we will discuss what will be the global goal of adaptation. And that is also the case for China. We do like a very clear target for adaptation. But we do have several aspects we believe need to promote to achieve the goal of establishing adaptive society. I think firstly, definitely to enhance the early warning system, that to establish a broader and precise warning for climate extremes that will help us to adapt to the negative impact of climate change. And also we need to enhance our disaster prevention system that, and as well as the emergency response system that to cope with those climate extremes if those extremes happens. And also probably the most challenging issues is how to integrate the adaptation into our infrastructure planning system, because of the difficulty is we need to plan the long-term infrastructure within a dynamic climate system, which means the climate will changing in the future. And we need to take that into account to plan our cities, to plan our dams, and to plan those infrastructures, which is not in place at this moment. And last but not least is we need to improve the paradigm, the concept regarding to the adaptation, and use that to change the behavior of our citizens, that to adapt to the negative impact of climate change. And to put those together, we will increase the probability that to establish this adaptive society in next 10 years.
So after hearing what you two said, I start to want to, dig into the adaptation side a little bit more. Is that we are sharing a lot of challenges, no matter from the EU or China or other countries in the world. And one of the biggest challenges I get from what you said is quantifying what is adaptation.
Yes, to some extent it is. Again, especially if we compare to the debate on mitigation. Mitigation, there are a lot of very concrete, very clear indicators that can be used. The amount of emissions of CO2 in the atmosphere, the number of parts per million of CO2 particles in the atmosphere. These are all very clear indicators, the evolutions of which provide us with a good monitoring devices or monitoring capacities as to how we fare on mitigation. Adaptation is arguably extraordinarily more complicated because it touches upon every single part of the economy in different ways. We were talking about potential cities efforts, infrastructure risk exposure to climate change, food system, food production. This is something that Europe is facing at the moment in a very, very clear way, because the southern part of Europe is due to become subject to drought, and very severe drought, and so to face very significant changes into its food production capacities, including from a cultural perspective. There are a number of products that are extraordinarily important from a cultural perspective in France or in Italy, for instance, so product that might not be able to be grown in these countries, putting in jeopardy the livelihood on so many different people, not just farmers, but the whole economy that depend on it. I didn't even mention energy, for instance. Of course, from a resilience perspective, energy generation, renewable energy generation, is a fundamental part of the EU strategy for the decades to come. Now that the dependency of the European Union on fossil fuel energies from other producers and exporters had been laid bare in recent years. The EU has woken up to the fact that energy production and generation, renewable sources, is a fundamental part of a good adaptation strategy. So, in one hand, again, I will try to turn challenges into opportunities. So, in the one hand, it's very hard to give clear targets and monitoring tools because it touches upon so many different sectors. But on the other hand, it also allows us to break down these different sectors and to have sort of different specific targets per sector that are all working into the direction of a good adaptation strategy at the European level.
And I start to think about in China, we are talking about a lot about transitions. We're talking about not only curb pollutions, we're not only talking about reduce emissions, we're also talking about to expand the green development. And I think green development is kind of an umbrella term that sort of cover a lot of sectors and different industries as well. So, Professor Teng, what do you see of China's transition? You also mentioned that for the next few years, or more than a few years, will be very critical transition period for China. So what direction is China's transition should take, and how should we take that to succeed in that transition?
Yeah, I think that you mentioned a very good term, which is the green development or low carbon development, whatever. Because of this concept, put two things together. One is the climate change, another is the development. I think that is how we persuade people that to cope with climate change will not only reduce the climate risk, but also contribute to the growth of the economy and also contribute to the well-beings of our citizens. That is how we bring peoples on board. Otherwise, they may believe that when we COVID climate change, we need to satisfy our development. That is not the story. The story is a win-win story. We can achieve them both instead of one or another. And also, I think that another very important issues for this transition is we can increase the competitiveness of our industries. That is also how China achieve a success in the transition story. We see that China dominate the production of solar PV, wind turbine, EVs, as well as batteries. That is the new engine of China's economy. And China benefit from this transition by developing its capacity of innovation in those sectors. And third, I think that is the transition should deliver a lower energy cost and to improve the energy security as well as the resilience of our energy system, that to supply the energy more clean and lower cost and more safe. I think that is how we can make the transition sustained and to have support from our citizens, from our people, and from our society. I think that is the lessons and experience of China's transition story.
And also, I'm very curious that when we're talking about, energy transition and energy security, a lot of people will think them as two separate things. But now, looking at these two terms, we'll start to seeing them sort of intertwined between each other. Transition and security can be accomplished at the same time.
I believe that they can be accomplished at the same time. But we also see the change of the definition on energy security recently. You know that in a fossil fuel era, the definition of the energy security very much focused on the supply of energy resources, where the coal or the oil came from. Is there any diversity of those supply from different suppliers? But in the new era of renewables, because of the wind and solars are resourceful, are everywhere. So there's no concerns of resource availability, but there is increasing concerns of technology availability and also the resilience of the power grid, because of the renewables are intermittent, right? There are a lot of volatility. So how to make sure that your power grid can supply the electricity at time you want is a challenge. But with the battery technology, with the innovation of various technology, I think that there is a clear trend that we can lower the energy cost and at the same time to reduce the carbon footprint of our energy supply and our energy consumption. So I do believe, yes, those two concepts are intertwined, and we can achieve those two targets at the same time.
And Antoine, I also want to check with you when it comes to, different technologies and also transitions. When it comes to renewables, I think a very famous international tale right now is the solar power, the solar power industry here in China, and also how China's involvement in that international market has been lower the price, benefiting a lot of countries. And so do you see that can be happening in other fields?
I can start by saying on the previous question, on the transition and security aspect, that in Europe they are even more than intertwined, they're merged. It's the same thing. I mean, the last years have demonstrating the dependency of the European Union on fossil fuels from external actors, that any move of these actors, here I'm speaking specifically of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, for instance, have seen the price of energy go through the roof on the European market. So the transition away from fossil fuels is a fundamental security objective of the EU. That is from a supply perspective and also from an affordability perspective. So all of social considerations attached to the climate transition are fundamentally linked to the energy transition. So this is now very, very clear in the minds of policymakers. So there's a clear consensus on that. Now the issue is, where do we produce these technologies and these products that allow the European Union and other parts of the world to actually transition away from fossil fuels and into renewable energy? That is the main challenge for European policymakers at the moment. So China has done exceedingly well as to developing as a powerhouse on these matters, and that has created a lot of concerns for EU citizens, policymakers, and the like, as to their capacity to maintain a good industrial base on energy-related products and services. So of course, this has also created frustration. This is at the heart of the difficult conversation between the EU and China at the moment, sometimes hindering actually our potential for cooperation in the climate realm. This is a fundamental industrial strategy question. So now it's up for our industrial group, it's now for our policymakers to come up with systems, frameworks that allow for best assets, let's say, to develop themselves, to become competitive, to actually gain market access into each other's regions, but also in third countries. I think this is a regular sort of competition among two major economic powers in the world. That's perfectly fine. I mean, that competition can and should happen. That happened in the past. It can continue to do so. Each region will have its own strengths and weaknesses, and needs to be clear as to how they can be, what these can be to develop their own, let's say, advantages and comparative advantage. These are still very much realities of the day. But at the end, what we need to remember is that for the EU, it's quite clear, all studies demonstrate that at the end, somewhere in the decade 2030, the renewable will be by far the most affordable energy source. So at the end of the day, the price will come down if the transition happens. So now it's really a question as to how do we get there. The next 10 years are absolutely crucial for the European Union. And at the moment, we need the production capacities of China in order to implement that transition. That is also a reality that sometimes is very hard for Europeans to acknowledge. So now I think there needs to be a meaningful conversation on trade issues, on productive capacities, on industrial development, and so on. That sometimes might be a bumpy road. We see it happening every day, but that doesn't mean that we should shy away from a healthy competition between the two blocks, so that at the end of the day, cheap or at least affordable energy transition can happen in both countries, because that's what's going to drive our competitiveness of the future. I fully agree with Professor on that particular.
That's very interesting, Anton. You mentioned that for the EU and China, that the two blocks, the two parts need to cooperate and also maintain a certain level of competition when it comes to technologies or industries related to, the green development. And some people in the EU cannot, turn their head around this concept. And why is that? And how do you think can help them to change their mindset and accept that, it's a competition and also cooperation relationship?
Well, this is the fundamental question between EU and China relations. The EU has a lot of difficulty to grasp the fact that now China is extraordinarily competent and competitive on some industrial segment that the EU used to dominate, including from a renewable energy perspective, but not only cars, for instance, electric vehicles. That obvious other example. So the EU, for so many decades, relied on cheap energy source from Russia, cheap products supplies from China, while retaining the competence and the capacity to develop innovative solutions for green tech, let's say, domestically. That has fundamentally shifted on all accounts. And the EU is struggling now to adapt to this new reality. But again, opportunity and challenges. I think if there's one thing that the private sectors and industry have demonstrated, that they can be adaptive to change and they can actually develop their own new competitive advantage in the face of new economic realities. So this is what needs to happen now. Because the alternative, the easy alternative, let's say, for policymakers is to put up barriers, is to protect domestic industrial market by putting up barriers to prevent the import from other sources. That is going to be part of the solution. I don't think we should shy away from that particular part because it's going to be, from a political perspective, it is going to be. And that can be fine, that can help the EU to retain some industrial base in the continent, which is important to maintain a certain level of job creations in the continent and so on. But also, remember the fact that the EU was built on open trade. And all of our value chains are essentially organized in such a way. And that's not going to change in a day or so. So now the EU needs to grasp this new reality, higher barriers that it's used to or comfortable with, but still while maintaining good cooperation capacities and good exchange capacities with other parts of the world. So eventually, they can develop their own new industrial reality.
So that's also in adaptation building in a way for the EU and also for a lot of countries around the world to adapt to new changes, not only climate change, but a lot of new changes happening around the world. And since we are turning into a more positive tune for this discussion, I also want to check with you too when it comes to, the potentials. What do you see are the promising field, technologies, industries, any economies that can shine at this COP30?
Well, from my perspective, I think that because of this COP is held in Brazil, so I think that there should be some progress on the deforestation, which definitely is one of the key sectors of the emission for Brazil, and is an area that we need to make substantial progress that to move forwards. And also, I have a lot of expectation on the achievement from adaptation agenda. This agenda has been lack of progress for many years, and this is an agenda which is critical for developing countries. And developing countries has asked for the increase of the financial pledge for adaptation for many years. I think that this will be the time that for the COP to make a decision to move this agenda much more forwards. I also have expectation on the finance roadmap. I expect the finance communities can come together and to have some common ground that to move things forwards. But unfortunately, I think this achievement probably has a much lower probability based on my assessment on the process. But as we have discussed in previous discussion, I do believe those finance is the most important part of means of implementation. Without this availability of those finance, it's very difficult for most of developing countries to implement and to increase their ambitions to cope with climate change.
And Professor Teng, I also have to follow up on finance. Is that when, the pledges are not fulfilled, what is the plan B for developing countries? They still have to live in the changing climate after all.
That is why, from my perspective, why the adaptation is a rising agenda item for this COP. Because we already see the increased impact from climate change in many developing countries. And they not only need to reduce their emission, but at the same time, they need to mobilize their resource to adapt to the changing climate. And for most of us, the resource is very limited. So it is at the all question. either you allocate your money to reduce emission or allocate your money to adapt to the climate change which is in place. So I think that, of course, we don't want developing countries in that kind of dilemma. But if that is the case, probably the most urgent issue is to adapt to climate change instead of further increase their ambitions for the future if they are placed into that dilemma. We want to avoid that dilemma. So I think that the opportunity window or the time window is stretching very fast, and we need to capture this window to avoid the happen of that dilemma.
I'd also want to check with Antoine. What do you see of the promising or potentials or prospects that you have for this COP? Is in the middle. We're sort of in the midway of the meetings.
I would echo a lot of the comments made by Professor. I will look at deforestation aspects with perhaps this new Tropical Forest Forever Fund initiative that's been launched officially a few days ago. So again, it's a question of how much can be actually invested in it, but that's could be an interesting new methodology to fight deforestation. So I'd be very keen to see where that goes. Of course, the main outcome of the COP, in my mind, is this roadmap for climate finance, as Professor has just mentioned. It's important for trust. It's important to actually kickstart the money flowing into the adaptation issues and so on. So that's one clear outcome to look forward to. I would still try to keep an eye on this operationalization of the transition away from fossil fuel. This is arguably among the most complicated conversations that are happening right now. Brazil itself is a major fossil fuel producer and is actually still looking for exploration and development of new projects under the argument that the legitimate argument that developing economy should actually develop their own capacities while developed countries have actually benefited from it for centuries. But at the end of the day, this cannot be the solution long term, because again, we need to transition away from fossil fuel. So any sort of meaningful conversation that can happen on how that transition could be implemented is, in my mind, still should remain very high on the agenda. And so if we come back to the notion of finance, because it relates to the question that you've just asked. In terms of Plan B, I fully agree with the professor that if developed economy don't honor their pledge, then it's not like we can just wait. The opportunity window to adapt to climate change is closing very, very, very rapidly, and it's just not an option to just wait for the money to come in. So, as I said, it's happening in Europe, but not only. Now, market forces are very, very much geared toward these new sectors. There's been more jobs created in clean energies than fossil fuels last year, for instance. So the market realities are more and more geared toward the transition. That means that if public funding, if pledges from developed economy are not materialized very quickly, developing countries should still do all of whatever they can, unleash any sort of effort that they can to grasp these market opportunities to develop into this green tech and etc. This can be on green technology products and services, for instance, like farming techniques for sustainable food system. It can be, of course, related to renewable energy generations at the community level. Now, more and more of these topics, of these tools are being made available at affordable prices for this community to actually develop this sort of capacities. So there are now many, many ways to capture the capital and beyond the capital, the actual technology, products and services that would allow for developing economies to engage into transition, to engage into adaptation activities, not necessarily just waiting for developed economy to honor their pledge.
So Antoine, so in your opinion, that no matter when it comes to shifts away from fossil fuels or transition towards clean energy, the main driver should be on the markets, should be economical, instead of just pressure, just putting on more pressures and sort of force people to make the choice.
We need both. We need both, absolutely. But we cannot wait on one to have the other. Pressure needs to be maintained on developed economy to honor their pledge, But if there's one thing that history tells us is that it's a complicated pledge to be honored. Developed economies are reluctant to honor these sort of pledges, and I'm afraid the current context, political context in most developed economy is not very conducive for these pledges to be honored. Might be even worse than it was in the past. So any pressure needs to be maintained, but in the meantime, developing economies should absolutely engage into mobilizing the market forces to engage in the transition nonetheless.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for very important insights at this year's COP30. And we're in the midway of the meetings. And we do hope that we can see some positive and also, I think, constructive outcomes coming out from Brazil this time. Thank you, Professor Teng. And also thank you, Antoine, on the line.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And that's it for this edition of Climate Watch. I'm Fei Fei. A huge thank you to Professor Teng Fei with Tsinghua University and Antoine Augy of the Institute for European Environmental Policy for sharing their insights. If you enjoy the show, you can find more episodes on your favorite podcast platform. Just search Climate Watch. Don't forget to leave us a quick review or share it with a friend. We'd also love to hear from you if you have stories to share about living in a changing climate or thoughts on any of our topics. Drop us a line at radio@cgtn.com. Thanks for sticking till the end. I'm Fei Fei, and I'll see you next time on Climate Watch.
This is CGTN Radio. Hear the difference.